Hello. So this is the final part of the last chapters of Politics UK, and it's also just the final video on UK politics. So I will go into a continued analysis on these chapters, followed by a closing reflection on just the book entirely and what I've gained as a general knowledge from the entire series. I recall in 2016 when Trump won the presidential election, and just how shocking it was, not necessarily because I believed Clinton was the better candidate, but because his voice was disruptive of the point of the integrative globalization that we had come to recognize of the world at that point. Brexit was similar in its disruptive changes in political order, with the similar sentiments of confusion of what was to become of the United Kingdom once it had a more independent role as it had before. So a good 9 years has passed since these two moments have happened, and I can see that Brexit actually shows similar trends to the whole disruptive success of Donald Trump's success, in that Brexit is a defining example for the United Kingdom of the developing protectionist and strategic autonomy shifts that countries like the United Kingdom are adopting. In this way, it is through leaving the European Union, and in the US, it was through Trump's disruptive processes. As the world is now entering this new era, from globalization to what we can probably call deglobalization, or just the decline of it, where we have reached the peak of globalization already, and like any peak, only goes downhill from then. With the United Kingdom's actions to reassert its sovereignty in the face of supranational sources of power like the European Union as an example of the transition from the globalization and globalized mindset towards protectionist adjacent policies. It seems that rather than a move towards further integration as a symptom of Francis Fukuyama's end of history concept from the early 90s following the Cold War and the end of the Cold War, which was the idea that the Washington Consensus, basically the West in a way, what was coming from the United States, would win, and eventually the world would only become more similarly democratic and globalized as time went on. So the world states instead have reached this boiling point in this global integration and are now resisting this model of globalization, opting to instead retreat back to the safety of their state's sovereignty. So I used to see history as this linear process, in this way of thinking where we only progress, so to speak, in a way of never going back to the past. But there is an issue with what progress means and whether we can truly ever go back to the past or simply try out a new way of doing things that resembles features of the past. So the Roman Empire, for example, was this large centralized force in Europe around the Common Era change, and when it broke up, which was succeeded by the medieval age, this was defined by a lack of centralization of powers as compared to during the Roman Empire. Eventually, the Westphalian states, the nation-state system eventually emerged, and now the nation-state is the accepted method of governance around the world, and where once again a centralization in state power is both widely accepted and expected of other nations. This is why we have the United Nations, essentially. In a way, we have reverted back to old ways of living, but we have also continued moving forward and letting technology and relationships develop the process of governing through centralized bodies, as that we are now entering a more decentralized way of other centralized powers rather than just the continued unity of the globalization project we have tried. In this way, Brexit was not necessarily a sign of progress for the future, nor was it even reactionary of the past entirely. Instead, it was a symptom of the ever fluctuating actions we have seen occur throughout history. As the Roman Empire was not destined to last forever, nor is globalization something that will necessarily go on until the emergence of a single world government unites the whole world or anything. The overall trend now is protectionism and strategic autonomy, and Brexit is a clear example of this next stage in history and moving forward in beliefs regarding where the centralization of powers should lie. When evaluating Brexit, it's also worth considering the racial undertones in both the decision to join in 1973 and its exit in 2016. Especially when we take into account English exceptionalism, unlike that in the United States, English exceptionalism has some stronger undertones of racial superiority in perceiving the English, and to some extent Britons, as a superior race to others, given the more ethnic identity strength that we find in Europe, as opposed to the United States and its defining history of recent migration. The author encourages us to consider how this context regarding race has proven itself applicable towards European Union actions, as by the 70s, the goal of the United Kingdom to engage with its Commonwealth for economic growth not only underdelivered what they expected, but also saw the recent surge in decolonialization in working with more African and Southeast Asian markets that were no longer as exclusively Anglo-Saxon English as before, when it was just Canada, Australia, New Zealand, those more Anglo-Saxon countries. This perhaps played a significant role in the United Kingdom's decision to integrate itself with the more Anglo-Saxon market as Europe, the European Union, than with the developing multiracial Commonwealth. This aligned with the growing call against immigration from far-right leaders at the time, like Enoch Powell and his River of Blood speech that showed early political signs against the integration of racially diverse peoples. We also begin to notice by the aughts, when Eastern European countries were becoming new additions to the European Union and thus closer to the United Kingdom, an amplification of xenophobic rhetoric concerning Eastern Europeans being able to affect and come into the United Kingdom strengthened parties like the British National Party and other immigration parties, which saw their powers in general increase by this time. And following the financial crisis by the end of the aughts, the United Kingdom Independence Party utilized immigration as a scapegoat for what was harming British society. Now, the aim of the UKIP was to exclude migrants from the same level of perceived easy access into the United Kingdom, but immigration as a term proved itself as a catch-all term to encapsulate the left behind sentiments against those who were not a part of what is essentially seen as a British ethnic original identity, as many anti-immigrant policies also affected those of ethnic identities regardless of their immigration status. Once Brexit succeeded in 2016, immigration was, and to this day, remains at the top of the list of Britain's concerns regarding the United Kingdom. This element of racial undertone in British decision-making has a history, and of course can't be the source of every British decision, but is a point worth considering, especially when balancing it with British exceptionalism as a way of asserting Britain's position on something like its EU membership. So some final notes as I have finished reading this book, which was a very informative book on United Kingdom policies and quite comparative and reflective on the United States and other countries. So I thought about how I read Russian Politics and Society by Richard Sakwa earlier this year. And I think it's worth noting here that Russia and the United Kingdom are similar in many ways than we tend to recognize, in that these two powers have both historically and today continued to see themselves as protectors of European culture and its identity. Both perceive the other as leading Europe down the wrong direction, i.e., from the United Kingdom's perspective, Russia's interference in European affairs and the invasion of Ukraine, and in the Russian perspective, the United Kingdom's large role in NATO and Western integration. But we must recognize that these two powers position themselves as leaders on opposite, yet not entirely contradictory ends of the scale in leading Europe. From reading about Russian exceptionalism and how it resembles the periphery status of being a leader for Europe, yet not entirely self-associated with the bloc, as the United Kingdom also kind of identifies itself, it shows that these two major powers that resemble in their relationships with Europe and that we usually where we usually consider in their respective senses of trying to save Europe from itself, i.e. Russia saves Europe from Nazi invasions. Britain has done the same also from Nazi growth. That's just one example in recent history. The United Kingdom is also an excellent example of a former superpower that was once the leading empire in a time before, yet it is now facing a decline in its power. However, it did not collapse like the Roman Empire, but instead we can study the United Kingdom today as an example of how a former superpower was best able to manage adapting to the New World Order and to move along with the future, while providing us some lessons into what becomes of former superpowers once they are surpassed by others, including, ironically, by a nation whose independence some 250 years ago they refused to recognize for some time. The United Kingdom provides unique and relevant insight into what might become of the United States once it loses its position as the world's superpower. Because if history has taught us anything, it is that superpowers only stay in their high positions until another power surpasses them, and no single power has managed to stay in its hegemonic stool forever. This isn't to necessarily anticipate the fall of the American or Western global hegemony, nor the collapse of the American states, but is instead to point out just how necessary studying the United Kingdom means for countries like the United States and being able to maneuver the eventual decline in our power, regardless if some might think it won't happen within our lifetimes. Or for others who actually think that this decline is starting to occur as we speak. The UK is also in an amazing case of balancing history with modernity. The fact that the same monarchy system and the royal descendants who have a relation in some way to the first kings of England are still upheld today in what is probably one of the most democratic countries in the world is something to take one's breath away once you think about it, because of how much change has occurred within the past millennium, yet some of these institutions have remained intact. Even the process of the Prime Minister receiving the monarch's permission to make a government in their name shows how history and tradition do not hold back a country from modernizing and even being a leader in the global domain. Instead, it shows how modernity, like democracy as we currently and widely perceive it to mean here in the West, can launch from even the most dated of nations and states, where traditions of an absolutist system of governance that dates back to a time when what used to be an appropriate way of governing is now seen as an exclusionary and oppressive way, the feudal system, as that emerged in the end of the Roman age and became known as just the slaves or the workers who worked very little for higher ups like lords. And it shows how these countries, like the United Kingdom, that did have these systems of power, can adapt to change, which is why we see the House of Lords continue to exist, but it is no longer as exclusionary as it once was, in terms of its power and its composition. The question then returns to the paradox of modernity and progress, how those are pretty interrelated, in that perhaps democratic change is not necessarily equivalent to progress, as history showed us in the end of the Roman Republic and to the empire that this was not necessarily the case. Instead, it was the opposite. Losing democratic systems was considered modernizing, progressing. Regardless, and also now, as undemocratic countries like China and Saudi Arabia are becoming more modernized, this challenges what it means to be modern, so to speak. But regardless of this whole modern and progress situation, which I will probably go into in other situations, the United Kingdom offers an invaluable case study into how a state that precedes the current notions of democracy or even the nation has been able to adapt to new world orders and actually was able to dominate the world at such an unprecedented scale at the time. And it can act as a resource for other nations to follow suit and study. Thank you for watching this series for these videos on United Kingdom politics, and I will see you in my other videos on other politics.